Okay, for more on this, we are now being joined by Dov Zachim from Washington, D.C. He is former Undersecretary of Defense during the George W. Bush administration. Mr. Zachim, thank you so much for joining us on WION. You perhaps understand the severity of this conflict more than anyone, considering the fact that you were a firsthand witness in the room when the disastrous 9/11 incidents happened here in the United States. This is now being called Israel's 9/11. There are some murmurs that some kind of ceasefire may be able to be negotiated. First of all, how appropriate is that? And is there anyone who's willing to step in and even make that suggestion?
Well, thank you very much for having me. By the way, my name is pronounced Zachheim. Um, uh, and regarding 9/11, if you recall, what happened was after the attack, President Bush, made clear actually to us in the Pentagon the next day that he was going to retaliate against Afghanistan if they didn't give up the terrorists. So we essentially, with the world's support, including that of Russia, including NATO agreeing to what's called Article 5, where everyone defends everyone else, we went to war thousands of miles away. Here we have a situation where it's not just murder, it's rape, it's killing little babies, it's killing Holocaust survivors. It is just abominable. And these people, not all Palestinians, I suspect the vast majority of Palestinians in Gaza can't stand Hamas, but Hamas are animals. And they have to be dealt with. And what has to happen, there are frankly right now two things that have to happen. The Israelis appear to have sealed the wall between them and Gaza, but they've got to first get these hostages out, including a number of Americans, including a number of wounded Americans, as well as people from other countries. And secondly, they've got to decapitate once and for all Hamas, give the people in Gaza a chance to have a decent government. What's really scary is that Qatar, in particular, has poured tons, hundreds of millions, maybe billions of dollars into Gaza. And instead of using that money for the benefit of their people, the Hamas people have simply used it to buy arms or get arms from Iran to build up a military capability in order to kill anybody who's Jewish, which, by the way, includes me. So I think anyone who suggests a ceasefire at this time is totally playing into Hamas's hands. And we have to root them out. I think we, the United States, have announced, President Biden's announced, it's bipartisan, by the way, Republicans support him on this, that we, working with the Israelis, must get the hostages out and go after Hamas. And I hope, deeply hope, that the Israelis will not find themselves in a 20-year quagmire like we did in Afghanistan. And I don't think they'll have to. But they've got to get rid of these Hamas murderers.
Mr. Zachheim, I apologize for mispronouncing your name. It's interesting that you mentioned that there is an op-ed in the New York Times today that talks about the way this nightmare just unfolded, Israel's 9/11, and what path the the Biden administration should take that perhaps should be less conservative than the Bush administration 20 years ago, considering the fact that the United States ultimately got involved in what many call a quagmire. Do you think the complexity of the war may change if the United States gets itself involved in one way or the other, and how likely is that?
Well, the Israelis have always prided themselves on fighting their own fights. They don't want American troops in there. They don't need them. They want American supplies. There's precedent for that, of course. In the 1973 war, President Nixon shipped all sorts of supplies to Israel on an emergency basis. That's what they need. They need air defenses. They need more drones. They need all kinds of communications equipment. They need intelligence support. They don't need American boys and girls on the ground there. They're getting some advice from our special forces that's been widely reported. and that's a good thing, but they can do the job themselves. And the one thing that we can do as Americans is deter Hezbollah, which, by the way, has killed an awful lot of Americans and American soldiers, deter them from spreading this war more widely. As long as the war is contained in Gaza, the Israelis can do the job themselves.
Do you think Iran is trying to get the United States into a greater conflict in the Middle East?
I don't think so. The Iranians aren't stupid. One thing you will not call the Iranians is stupid. They know that if the United States gets involved in a war in the Middle East, it's a war against them, and they're not going to win, to put it mildly. And given the disruptions inside Iran, the resentment of the Ayatollahs know full well that a war will mean the end of their regime. So I don't think they'll do that. What I think they want several things. First, obviously, they wanted to humiliate Israel. But second, and more important, they wanted to break up any possibility of Israel having an arrangement with Saudi Arabia. Now, obviously, the Saudis have made it very clear that they're not going to make a formal arrangement with Israel. Excuse me, please. They won't make a formal arrangement with Israel as long as Israel continues to treat the Palestinians the way it has. And they're right. The Palestinians have been mistreated. It's not apartheid. It's much more like what we had in the United States during the early part of the previous century, what's called Jim Crow, where we mistreated Black Americans. And that's just damn wrong. And the Israeli government in particular, and I have written calling for Mr. Netanyahu and his right-wing extremists to leave the government and put in somebody like General Gantz, who's much more moderate, and be much more sensitive to the Arab Israelis that live inside Israel itself and those that Israel controls on the West Bank. And so the Saudis have a point anyway, and it wasn't clear they were going to make a deal, but the Iranians want to be so sure that Saudi Arabia and Israel could not get together that they gave Hamas the green light to do the atrocities they've done.
Mr. Undersecretary, thank you so much for joining us on WION from Washington, D.C. And I look forward to speaking to you again very soon and, hopefully under better circumstances, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I totally agree with you. Let's hope for the best.